The timeline of life, the Silurian period. The Silurian period lasted about 24.6 million years and is the shortest period of the Paleozoic era. Land masses were low and sea levels were rising. Fossils indicate that the rich seawaters allowed for extensive reef building. The supercontinent Gondwana drifted south. Two smaller continents, Laurentia and Baltica, were near the equator. A third continent, Avalonia, began to drift north off of Gondwana. These three northern continents collided to form Euro-America. The hills and mountains of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Sweden, Norway, and the northern Appalachian Mountains were formed. Sand dollars and starfish were still in the oceans during this time. The starfish had a broad center and 5 smaller thin arms, and they were about 4 inches across. Sea lilies were also prevalent in the oceans during this time. They were the Silurian crinoids, flower-like and about 6 inches tall. One type of coral that could be found in the oceans was the horn corals. They were anywhere from being very tiny to about 6 inches long. Soft animals lived inside the cone and would use their tentacles to trap food. Obviously, since the soft animals were soft-bodied, there was no fossil remains of those animals. The only thing that remains is the horn coral. The other type of corals that could be found were in the colonial corals. There were all different kinds and shapes. Little animals lived in them and could face in all directions, or sometimes they would just simply form long chains. When old corals would die, new ones would grow on top, which would form the extensive coral reefs. Radiolaria are single-celled protozoas. They lived by the billions on or above the seafloor. In fact, they still do. It was also during this time that we saw the first millipedes. They were arthropods akin to the sea worms, and they were the first to begin to colonize land. We also began to see the early forms of lichen, tiny plants able to adapt to harsh conditions. They tended to grow in Arctic zones, and they began to prepare land for life. Let's look back at our timeline. Look at some of the growth of the lifelines of the radiolaria and the coral reefs, and you can see our poor trilobites coming very near to the end of their extinction. We also begin to see the beginning of early land plants, the lichens. And we also see the plants that decided they could stick their head up out of the water and still breathe and still live, our marsh plants. Sea lilies really begin to take form in the oceans. Finally, at the end of the Silurian period, we have another ice age.